Greetings, Pencrest Science students. This is Mr. Del Prado here, and today I'm going to talk briefly about the mechanism of natural selection um, and essentially Darwin's theory of evolution. So remember again, Darwin did not invent evolution in the same way that Robert Hooke didn't invent cells, Watson and Crick didn't invent DNA. They're just the people that discovered it. So Darwin is just the guy who discovered the mechanism for natural selection. So although he was at the Galapagos Islands at age 22, he did not publish his findings until he was 50 years old. You may have heard of that. It's called The Origin of the Species. The big picture to take from this slide is if you look at that tree over on the right-hand side, it's important to note that it is not an evolutionary ladder where humans are at the top and everything else is underneath of us. Things like chimpanzees and orangutans and even like beetles and ants, they don't secretly want to become humans. They simply are just on a different part of the evolutionary tree. As long as they're able to survive and reproduce, then they're going to be perfectly okay. Okay, so here we go. This is how the mechanism works, and it's actually really simple and kind of elegant if you think about it. So we already know from genetics that individuals within a population vary. We've looked at that when we looked at our genetics unit, right? And we looked at all of our genetics traits that were all different from one another. We also know that in general, within species, populations tend to produce more offspring than there is food, space, and other things to help them survive. So what happens then is that individuals within a population, they compete for resources. Okay, so there is competition then for food, there's competition for mates, there's competition for a safe place to live. What happens is this, is that within our variations, most of our variations don't mean much of anything. The fact that Mr. Dell is colorblind is not affecting my ability to survive and reproduce. It is simply a variation. And in fact, some variations can actually hurt an individual. But every now and then, there is a variation that comes along. And remember, that variation comes along through genetic mutation. It also comes along through that mixing of genes during meiosis. Every now and then, a variation comes along that helps an organism survive and reproduce. When that happens, that variation is kept within a population. Why? Well, the organism survived with that variation and it reproduced. An organism that didn't have that variation might be less likely to survive and reproduce. So their variation gets eliminated, but the variation that is beneficial gets passed on to the next generation. So it's important to note that each habitat presents unique challenges in order to survive. So what's a good variation in one environment might not be a good variation in another environment. So what a variation that is selected for an organism that lives underwater would obviously be much different than a variation that is selected for in an organism that lives on the side of a cliff. Nevertheless, a variation that is selected for that allows you to better survive and reproduce is called an adaptation. It's the accumulation of these adaptations over time that allow one species to become another species. That process is called speciation. Here's the actual steps. Step number one, within a population we have overproduction. That is, there's too many individuals within a population. Okay? They're going to compete for resources. Step two, within that population, there is variation. There are differences among those individuals. Step number three, and I want to be clear about step number three. It's not like Mother Nature is out there with a conscious effort picking organisms to survive and other organisms to die. It's simply that every now and then there's a variation that allows an organism to better survive and reproduce in its environment. That variation gets selected for and gets passed on to the next generation. How? The organism survives, finds a mate, and reproduces. The variation that doesn't help you survive and reproduce is simply lost. The individual ends up dying, not reproducing, and so that variation gets lost within a population. So over time, then, we get this accumulation of adaptations These are variations that allow an organism to better survive and reproduce. You can think of a human brain over time. Over time, there have been variations that have made our brain a little bit bigger. It has more folds in it. It has more regions in it, so that it allows us to outsmart our competition. Human beings are a great example of evolution because we can look at the brain and we can actually track its size over time. And remember, evolution by definition is simply the change of organisms over time. So the accumulation of these beneficial adaptations over time is called natural selection. Nature is selecting unconsciously, but selecting nonetheless, selecting the traits that are going to be passed on to the next generation, and also selecting, again, unconsciously, but selecting traits that do not help an individual and they get lost within a population. Okay, so here we go. We're at the end here. How do variations arise within a population? They arise by mutation, and they also arise by crossing over in meiosis 1 in prophase 1. Darwin's theory of natural selection is that within any population there is variations that allow us to better survive and reproduce are called adaptations. The accumulation of those adaptations over time is what allows organisms or populations of organisms to change or evolve over time. Hope this makes sense. We're going to have a couple of videos and other lab activities to kind of cement this idea into your head. And hopefully we'll see you on the other side. Thanks for listening.